After the wedding you'll hand us the house. Then you can spend the rest of your life alone. Somewhere we never have to see you again. My son's fiancée smiled as she said those words across my own kitchen table, then calmly slid a prenuptial agreement toward me, as if she had just offered me another cup of coffee. She didn't know I had already noticed the clause that mentioned property my son didn't even own yet. She also had no idea that before she ever walked into my house, I had spent nearly 4 decades building bridges by finding tiny cracks everyone else ignored. And people, I've learned, aren't much different. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments what time it is where you're watching from today. My name is Walter Bennett. I'm 67 years old, retired after 39 years as Chief Structural Engineer for the Colorado Department of Transportation, and until that afternoon, I believed the hardest structures to inspect were made of concrete and steel. I was wrong. The hardest structures to inspect are families, because they can look perfectly stable, while already collapsing from the inside. Just 3 weeks earlier I had been pressure washing my patio when Ethan unexpectedly drove into my driveway. My son climbed out of his SUV, grinning like a man who had finally found everything he'd ever wanted. Beside him stood a woman I had never seen before. "Dad," he said proudly, "I'd like you to meet Vanessa Sterling. We're getting married." I honestly thought he was joking. Ethan was 36 years old, and had never bought a car without researching it for months. Yet somehow he had become engaged, without ever mentioning he was dating anyone. Vanessa walked toward me with perfect confidence, extended her hand, and smiled warmly. "Mr. Bennett, Ethan has told me so much about you." Her manners were flawless. Her clothes were elegant without looking extravagant. Every word sounded thoughtful. If someone had recorded only that first meeting, they would have believed she was the perfect future daughter-in-law. I almost believed in myself. Almost. While I made coffee, I listened from the kitchen as Ethan pointed out family photographs, my late wife's quilt, and the small workshop where we'd built birdhouses together when he was a boy. Vanessa barely looked at any of them. Instead she asked how many acres the property covered, whether the neighborhood still appreciated in value, and if I had ever considered downsizing now that I lived alone. They weren't offensive questions. They were simply the wrong questions for someone who had supposedly fallen in love with my son. We sat together in the dining room, and after only 20 minutes Ethan reached into his briefcase. "Vanessa had a great idea," he said. "A prenup, total transparency, protection for both of us." He handed me the document with complete confidence. I adjusted my glasses and began reading. Most of it looked routine until one paragraph caught my attention. Then another. The wording quietly expanded future marital assets to include certain inherited property, after a specific period if ownership became commingled. It was written so smoothly that most people would never question it. I closed the document without changing my expression and handed it back. "Looks thorough," I said. Vanessa watched my face carefully before smiling. "I believe successful families should always think about the future. Successful families. Not happy families. Not loving families. Successful families." That single choice of words stayed with me long after they drove away. Later that evening I carried the prenup into my study and read every page again, this time like an engineer examining blueprints before construction begins. Hidden inside polished legal language were small details that didn't belong there. Individually they meant very little. Together they formed a pattern. I reached for a red pen, circled 3 separate clauses, and wrote one word across the top of the first page. Why? At that moment, I still believed I was simply being an overprotective father. I had no idea that answering that one question would eventually force me to stop my own son's wedding before it destroyed the rest of his life. 3 weeks passed, and I acted exactly the way Vanessa expected me to. I smiled through wedding planning, complimented venues, discussed guest lists, and never mentioned the prenup again. If she was watching me, I wanted her to believe she'd already convinced me. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, everything changed. An old colleague invited me to lunch at a steakhouse in downtown Denver to celebrate his retirement. I arrived 20 minutes early, something I'd done for almost 40 years. Habit is difficult to retire. I had just been seated when movement near the back of the restaurant caught my attention. Vanessa walked in wearing sunglasses and a navy coat, but she wasn't alone. A man in his mid-40s stood to greet her before she even reached the table. He kissed her cheek, not the polite greeting between business associates, but the familiar gesture of 2 people who had done it many times before. I watched them laugh as though they had forgotten the rest of the room existed. My first instinct was to walk over and drag Ethan into the truth he deserved to see. Instead, 39 years of engineering overrode 5 seconds of anger. A bridge isn't condemned because of one crack. It's condemned because every crack points to the same structural failure. I quietly moved to another table with a better view, opened the news app on my phone, and activated the camera without drawing attention. Over the next 25 minutes, I photographed everything. Their hands touching across the table, her fingers brushing his wrist. The way she leaned forward whenever she smiled. They weren't hiding affection, they were hiding it poorly. When lunch ended, they left separately, waiting almost 2 minutes between exits. That told me more than the photographs ever could. Innocent people don't stagger their departures. I followed at a distance until the man entered a black Mercedes parked 2 rows away. Before he drove off, I photographed the license plate. My colleague arrived moments later. But I barely tasted the meal. My mind was already somewhere else. That evening I called an old friend who had spent 30 years covering city government for the Denver Post before retiring. If anyone could quietly identify a vehicle owner without asking unnecessary questions, it was Frank. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. "The car belongs to Derek Sullivan," he said. "Luxury property broker, big commissions. Works almost exclusively with high net worth clients." I thanked him and hung up. Derek Sullivan. The name meant nothing to me, but one fact refused to leave my mind. Vanessa had told Ethan she was spending that afternoon meeting a bride about floral arrangements. Instead, she had shared dessert with another man. That alone was enough to raise questions. It wasn't enough to destroy a wedding. I needed facts that couldn't be explained away with clever excuses or convincing tears. The following morning, I drove to a modest brick office on the edge of downtown, where a brass plaque beside the door read Graham Pierce Investigations. Graham listened without interrupting as I handed him the photographs, the copy of the prenup, and Derek Sullivan's name. When I finished, he studied the pictures for nearly a minute before looking back at me. "Are you trying to prove she's unfaithful?" he asked quietly. "Or are you trying to prove she's dangerous?" I held his gaze without hesitation. "I'm trying to find out which answer will save my son's life." Graham slowly closed the folder, leaned back in his chair, and gave a single nod. "Then don't call your son yet," he said. "Give me 2 weeks. As I stood to leave, he stopped me with one final sentence. "Mr. Bennett, if my instincts are right, you won't be bringing your son flowers before his wedding." He paused. "You'll be bringing him evidence." Exactly 14 days later, Graham Pierce called at 8:17 on a Monday morning. His voice sounded flatter than usual. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "I'd rather not discuss this over the phone. Can you come to my office?" That was all I needed to hear. People don't protect you from good news. When I arrived, a thick black binder was waiting in the middle of his desk. Graham didn't slide it toward me immediately. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee, sat down across from me, and quietly said, "Everything in this report has been verified through public records, surveillance, financial documents, or independent witnesses. Nothing here is speculation." Then he opened the binder. The first section contained a marriage certificate. Vanessa Sterling had married a software entrepreneur named Matthew Collins 4 years earlier. Less than 18 months later, she filed for divorce and walked away with a 6-figure financial settlement. The next section revealed another marriage, this time to Jonathan Hayes, a commercial property developer. Different city, different husband, nearly identical timeline. Another carefully negotiated settlement. Another substantial transfer of assets. I kept turning pages. The similarities became impossible to ignore. Every relationship moved at remarkable speed. Every engagement included an unusually detailed prenuptial agreement. Every marriage ended shortly after financial protections shifted in her favor. Graham quietly placed 2 photographs beside the binder. They showed Vanessa and Derek Sullivan entering the same boutique hotel on 3 separate evenings over the previous 2 weeks. Another photograph showed them meeting together the following morning. The timestamps were hours apart. They were less than 12 minutes apart. "They've been seeing each other for at least 10 months, Graham said. I looked up. "Longer than she's known Ethan?" He nodded once. "By several months." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I wasn't looking at evidence of an affair anymore. I was looking at evidence of a business model. Graham turned to the final section of the report. Bank records couldn't be obtained legally, but travel records, hotel reservations, business registrations, and surveillance painted a remarkably clear picture. Derek wasn't simply another man in Vanessa's life. He appeared before every engagement, disappeared during every marriage, and quietly returned before every divorce. "In my opinion," Graham said carefully, "they're not hiding a relationship." He paused. "They're running an operation." I closed the binder and rested both hands on its cover. My son wasn't about to marry the wrong woman by accident. He had been selected, groomed, studied. Every conversation about my retirement, every question about my house, every smile across my dining table, suddenly fit together, like pieces of the same blueprint. Graham reached into his desk drawer and handed me one last envelope. Inside were printed screenshots of Vanessa's public speaking schedule. Every conference where she claimed to have met wealthy professionals. Every networking event attended by Derek Sullivan. Their calendars overlapped almost perfectly for 3 years. "There's one more thing," Graham said quietly. "I found 2 men whose lives look remarkably similar to Ethan's. If you're willing to keep digging, I believe they'll talk." I looked down at the binder one final time before answering. "No." Graham frowned slightly. "No." I stood up, took the binder under my arm, and looked him straight in the eye. "We're not digging anymore." I paused, just long enough for him to misunderstand me. Then, I finished the sentence. "From this point forward, we're building a case." I left Graham's office hearing the binder could destroy a wedding, but I wasn't interested in destroying a wedding. I wanted to save my son before it became a marriage. The difference mattered. That afternoon, I drove straight to Catherine Monroe's office. She had spent more than 3 decades protecting families from financial exploitation, and if there was one person I trusted to separate emotion from strategy, it was her. Catherine read Graham's report without interruption, occasionally making notes in the margins. When she finished, she closed the binder and looked directly at me. "If you confront Ethan today," she said, "Vanessa will convince him you're a frightened father who can't accept change. You'll lose your son, and she'll gain complete control." I already knew she was right, but hearing someone else say it made the decision even harder. "So what do we do?" I asked. Catherine slid the prenuptial agreement back across the desk. "We stop arguing with suspicions and start collecting facts she can't explain." She outlined the plan with the calm precision of a surgeon. Every conversation with Vanessa would be documented. Every financial question she asked would be answered carefully while being recorded. Every inconsistency would become another brick in a wall of evidence. Colorado allowed one-party consent recordings, which meant I could legally record any conversation I was part of. Before leaving her office, I bought a professional voice-activated recorder and tested it 3 times in my truck. 2 days later, Ethan and Vanessa came over for Sunday brunch. She arrived carrying pastries from an expensive bakery and greeted me with the same flawless smile that had impressed me the day we met. If I hadn't seen Graham's report, I might have believed every expression on her face. The recorder rested silently inside my shirt pocket as we talked about flowers, seating charts, and honeymoon destinations. 20 minutes later, exactly as Catherine predicted, Vanessa gently steered the conversation toward my future. "Walter," she said warmly, "have you ever thought about updating your estate plan? Families change, and documents should change with them." I shrugged as though the subject bored me. I've been meaning to get around to it. Her eyes brightened for only a fraction of a second. "It's worth doing sooner rather than later. I've seen families lose fortunes simply because paperwork wasn't organized." Ethan smiled proudly, believing she was showing concern for me. I noticed something else. Vanessa never once asked what I wanted after retirement. She only asked what would happen to what I owned after I was gone. Over the next 2 weeks, she called me 4 different times. Each conversation began with wedding details but slowly drifted back to my finances. Had I named a beneficiary on my investment accounts? Was the house held personally or through a trust? Had I considered simplifying the transfer process for Ethan? I answered every question with polite uncertainty, while the recorder captured every word. By the end of the 2nd week, a pattern had emerged so clearly that even Catherine smiled when she listened to the recordings. "She's becoming impatient," she said. "That usually means she's working toward a deadline." "The wedding," I replied. Catherine nodded. "Exactly." She organized every recording into a growing evidence file, but before I left her office that afternoon, she handed me a separate folder with 2 names written across the front: Matthew Collins, Jonathan Hayes. I looked at her. "The former husbands? They're no longer just names in Graham's report," she answered. "I've located both of them." I stared at the folder for several seconds. If those 2 men were willing to talk, I had a feeling everything I thought I knew about Vanessa Sterling was only the beginning. I met Matthew Collins on a quiet Wednesday morning at a coffee shop, overlooking the South Platte River. He arrived 5 minutes early, carrying himself like a man who had spent years trying to forget a chapter of his life that refused to stay buried. At first he answered my questions carefully, almost defensively. Then I placed a recent photograph of Vanessa and Derek Sullivan on the table between us. The color disappeared from his face. He stared at the picture for several long seconds before letting out a slow breath. "He's still around," he whispered, I should have known. Matthew admitted that Derek had introduced himself as a business associate during his marriage, always appearing just often enough to seem harmless but never often enough to attract suspicion. By the time Matthew realized Derek and Vanessa were working together, the divorce had already stripped away years of savings and a vacation property he'd inherited from his parents. She never rushed me, he said quietly. She made every decision feel like it was mine. That sentence stayed with me because Ethan had been saying exactly the same thing. Before we left, Matthew signed a sworn statement, detailing everything that had happened during his marriage, and agreed to testify if necessary. 2 days later, I drove to Colorado Springs to meet Jonathan Hayes. Unlike Matthew, Jonathan didn't look surprised when I mentioned Vanessa's name. He simply laughed once, a tired laugh from someone who had already accepted how expensive trust could become. He opened the file cabinet beside his desk and removed a folder nearly 2 inches thick. "I've been waiting for someone to ask," he said. Inside were emails, settlement documents, copies of financial agreements, and handwritten notes describing conversations almost identical to the recordings Catherine had collected. The same compliments, the same discussions about estate planning, the same carefully timed pressure to combine assets. Even the wording in the prenuptial agreement matched Ethan's almost line for line. Before I left, Jonathan looked me straight in the eye. "Your son still has a chance," he said. I didn't. Driving home, I realized I was no longer looking at isolated tragedies. I was looking at a system refined over years until it became almost impossible to detect. That afternoon I met Catherine Monroe again. She carefully added both sworn statements to our evidence file before sliding another folder across the desk. "Now we protect your side of the board," she said. Over the next 3 hours, we updated every estate document I owned. My home, investment accounts, retirement funds, and future inheritance plans were transferred into a protected family trust, with strict distribution rules that prevented any future spouse of Ethan from obtaining indirect control. Even if Ethan married Vanessa the following morning, she would gain absolutely nothing from assets I'd spent a lifetime building. Catherine closed the final document, and smiled for the first time since we began working together. "Legally," she said, "she's already lost." I nodded, but I wasn't interested in winning in court. I wanted Ethan to walk away before he ever needed to court. As I gathered the folders to leave, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Ethan. "Dad, Vanessa wants us all to have dinner Friday night. She says it's time we finally feel like one family before the wedding." I looked at Catherine. She didn't even need to read the message before answering. "Go," she said calmly. "People become careless when they believe they've already won." Friday night's dinner confirmed every warning Catherine had given me. Vanessa arrived wearing the same effortless smile she always wore whenever she believed she was in control. She greeted me with a hug, complimented the wine I'd chosen, thanked me for supporting the wedding, and spent the first half hour behaving exactly like the perfect future daughter-in-law. Then, little by little, the conversation shifted. She asked whether I decided to update my estate plan before the wedding. She wondered if Ethan had already been added to every investment account. She even suggested that families avoided unnecessary legal problems when financial decisions were made, while everyone was healthy and thinking clearly. Ethan never noticed how carefully she guided the discussion. He only smiled proudly every time she spoke. I answered every question with the same calm uncertainty I practiced for weeks, while the recorder inside my jacket captured every word. By the end of dinner, Vanessa believed she had extracted exactly what she wanted. That I was an aging widower who understood very little about trusts, estate law, or asset protection. She left my house more confident than when she had arrived. I considered that a successful evening. Over the following 2 weeks, Ethan slowly disappeared from my daily life. Our Sunday breakfasts became text messages. Phone calls grew shorter. Whenever I suggested meeting alone, Vanessa somehow already had other plans. Wedding tastings, dance rehearsals, meetings with photographers. It wasn't obvious enough to alarm Ethan, but it was obvious enough for me. She wasn't trying to keep me away from the wedding. She was trying to keep me away from my son. One evening, Ethan finally called. His voice sounded uncomfortable. "Dad, Vanessa thinks you've been acting differently lately." I already knew where the conversation was heading. Differently? How? He hesitated. "She says you're asking strange questions. Watching her too closely. Like you don't trust her." I looked out the kitchen window before answering. "And what do you think?" Silence. Long enough to tell me he didn't know anymore. "I think," he finally said, "I think maybe you're having trouble accepting that I'm starting my own family." Those words weren't Ethan's. They were Vanessa's, delivered through the man she intended to marry. I could almost hear Catherine's voice reminding me that manipulation is most effective when the victim believes the idea was their own. If that's what you believe, I said quietly, then I won't argue with you. Another silence followed. Then Ethan sighed. I still want you at the wedding. Does Vanessa? This time he didn't answer immediately. She'll be fine. It wasn't the answer I'd asked for. After we ended the call, I drove straight to Catherine's office. Every recording, every surveillance photograph, every sworn statement, every legal document was now organized into 3 identical evidence binders, each indexed by date, source, and supporting documentation. Catherine reviewed them one final time, before locking 2 copies inside her office safe, and handing me the 3rd. If anything happens to this one, she said, the others remain protected. I slipped the binder into a leather briefcase that had traveled with me to hundreds of engineering meetings over the years. This would be its most important journey. Before leaving, Catherine asked the question neither of us had wanted to face. Walter, are you prepared for the possibility that Ethan may choose her even after seeing everything? I stood quietly for several seconds before answering. If I show him the truth, and he still walks away with her. I paused. Then at least he'll be making an informed decision instead of living inside someone else's lie. Catherine nodded slowly. Then there's nothing more we can do. 3 days later, I buttoned my charcoal suit, picked up the same briefcase, and drove toward the manor house in Littleton. As the wedding guests filled the garden and music floated through the summer air, I realized that I wasn't attending my son's wedding anymore. I was walking into the final stage of an investigation that had been building for nearly 3 months. I just didn't know that Vanessa Sterling was about to make one mistake so arrogant. It would save me from having to interrupt the ceremony at all. The ceremony ended exactly at 3:42 that afternoon. My son kissed his bride while nearly 200 guests applauded, believing they had just witnessed the beginning of a beautiful marriage. I was the only person in that garden who knew they had actually witnessed the final moments before everything collapsed. I stayed exactly where I was during the photographs, smiling when the photographer asked me to, shaking hands with relatives, accepting congratulations from people who had no idea. Why the leather briefcase never left my side. Vanessa barely looked at me during the ceremony. She didn't need to anymore. As far as she was concerned, she had already won. By the time everyone moved into the ballroom for the reception, she was no longer hiding her confidence. She stayed close to Ethan whenever guests approached, but constantly glanced in my direction, almost as if she was waiting for the moment she could finally stop pretending. Dinner ended. The best man finished his toast. The applause faded. While the band prepared for the first dance, Vanessa quietly excused herself from a group of guests and walked straight toward my table. She didn't sit down. She simply leaned over until her face was only a few inches from mine, smiling brightly, so anyone watching would think she was thanking her new father-in-law. Instead, she whispered, "It's over, Walter." I looked up without saying anything. Her smile widened. "You did your job. You paid for the wedding. You welcomed me into the family. You even helped Ethan trust me even more by pretending to support us." She paused just long enough to enjoy the next sentence. "Now, it's time for you to disappear." I held her gaze. She wasn't angry. She wasn't emotional. She was celebrating. "Ethan and I need our own life." She continued softly. "No unexpected visits. No opinions. No family dinners. You'll see us on holidays if we have time. Other than that." She shrugged, almost playfully. Old men should know when they're no longer needed. I studied her face for several seconds. During my career I had watched concrete fail under impossible pressure, but I'd never seen confidence collapse as quickly as it did after 7 simple words. I adjusted my tie, smiled politely, and answered just loudly enough for only her to hear. "I'll leave." I paused, watching the certainty in her eyes remain completely untouched. "But I won't be leaving alone." The smile disappeared instantly. She blinked twice, trying to understand what I meant. "What does that mean?" she asked. I slowly stood, picked up my briefcase, and buttoned my jacket. "You'll find out in about 10 minutes. For the first time since I met her." Vanessa looked genuinely unsettled. She glanced across the room toward Ethan, then back at me. "Whatever game you think you're playing," she whispered. "Today is my wedding day. Don't embarrass yourself." I smiled again, this time because I finally recognized something I hadn't seen in her before. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of losing control. Without answering, I walked calmly toward the DJ's booth. Behind me, I could hear her heels striking the marble floor as she hurried after me, no longer smiling for the guests. The DJ noticed me approaching and immediately handed me the wireless microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, he announced cheerfully. It's time to hear a few words from the groom's father, youth. Nearly 200 conversations stopped at once. Ethan looked over from the head table with a warm smile, expecting an ordinary wedding toast. Vanessa reached him a second later and grabbed his arm so tightly I saw her knuckles turn white. I stood in the center of the ballroom, microphone in one hand, my leather briefcase in the other, and looked directly at my son. Ethan, I said calmly, before I congratulate you, I need exactly 10 minutes alone with you. The smile vanished from his face. Around the room, confused whispers began spreading from table to table. Vanessa took one quick step forward. Walter, she said, forcing another smile for the guests. Whatever this is can wait until tomorrow. I turned toward her for the first time since leaving my table. No, I replied quietly. Tomorrow will already be too late. The ballroom remained silent as Ethan looked from me to Vanessa, unsure which direction his life was supposed to move next. Finally, he took a slow breath and nodded. 10 minutes, he said quietly. Vanessa immediately tightened her grip on his arm. Absolutely not, she interrupted. Whatever your father wants to say can wait until after the reception. Ethan gently pulled his arm free. I gave him my word. It was the first time all afternoon he had disagreed with her. I turned without another word and walked toward the private library beside the ballroom. Ethan followed. Just before the door closed, Vanessa tried to step inside behind us. I blocked the entrance with one hand. This conversation is between a father and his son. He's my husband now, she snapped. Exactly, I replied calmly. That's why he deserves to hear this without someone answering for him. I closed the door. The room became completely silent. Ethan folded his arms and looked at me with obvious frustration. Dad, you've already embarrassed everyone out there, whatever this is. Please, make it worth it. I placed the leather briefcase on the table and opened the first evidence binder. Everything you're about to see has been verified by licensed investigators, court records, and sworn statements. I slid the first document toward him. A certified marriage certificate. Vanessa Sterling, Matthew Collins. Ethan frowned. She told me she'd only been married once. Keep reading. He turned the page. Divorce settlement, financial transfer, timeline. Then another marriage certificate. Jonathan Hayes. Another divorce. Another settlement. His eyes slowed as he reached the next section. Dad, he whispered, there's more. I laid several photographs across the table. Vanessa and Derek Sullivan, entering restaurants together, holding hands outside a hotel, walking through downtown Denver, with their arms around each other. Every photograph carried a date and timestamp. Ethan picked up one picture and stared at it without blinking. This, his voice almost disappeared. This was 4 days before we got engaged. I nodded once. Keep going. His hands were beginning to shake now. I pressed the play button on a small digital recorder. Vanessa's voice filled the room. 1. Professional. Curious. She was asking me about my house, my retirement accounts, my trust, and whether I planned to update my will before the wedding. Ethan looked up. You recorded her. Legally. I stopped the recording and opened the final section of the binder. Now listen carefully. A different recording began. This one wasn't made by me. The sound quality was rougher, but the voices were unmistakable. Vanessa laughed softly. 12 more reaps and everything falls into place. Derek answered. Ethan still doesn't suspect anything. He's easier than the others, Vanessa replied without hesitation. No siblings, devoted to his father. Once Walter updates his estate plan, everything eventually flows through Ethan, and then through us. Derek laughed. You're getting better at this every year. Then came the sentence that emptied every expression from my son's face. By the time he realizes the marriage was only part of the plan, it'll be far too late. I stopped the recording. The silence that followed felt heavier than every word we heard. Ethan remained frozen, staring at the recorder as though it might somehow explain itself. Finally he looked at me, his face completely drained of color. That's really her voice. Yes. She called our marriage. Part of her plan. Yes. He slowly lowered himself into the nearest chair, both hands covering his face. For nearly a full minute, he didn't speak. When he finally looked up again, there were tears in his eyes, but something else had replaced the confusion. Clarity. He closed the binder, stood up without another question, and walked toward the door. Before opening it, he stopped with his hand on the handle and said, the one sentence I had prayed to hear ever since this nightmare began. Dad. He swallowed hard. Don't say another word out there. He turned to face me one last time. I'll end this myself. Then he opened the door and walked back into the reception hall alone. When Ethan walked back into the ballroom alone, every guest turned toward him. The music had stopped. Conversations had died away. Nearly 200 people were waiting for someone to explain why the groom had disappeared with his father in the middle of the reception. Vanessa hurried toward him with a practiced smile, reaching for his hand before he had taken 3 steps. "Honey," she said softly, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Let's forget whatever your father told you and get back to our guests." Ethan looked down at her hand resting on his arm. Then, without saying a word, he gently removed it. It was such a small movement that most people barely noticed. "I did. So did Vanessa." The confidence she'd carried all afternoon disappeared for the first time. "Ethan," she whispered. He looked directly into her eyes. "How long?" She blinked. "What are you talking about? How long have you and Derek Sullivan been together?" Her face rose for barely a second before she laughed nervously. "Your father filled your head with lies." Ethan didn't react. "I asked you a question." Several guests were now openly watching. The best man slowly stepped back. Even the wedding planner stopped moving. Vanessa looked around the room, searching for an escape she couldn't find. "He's a business associate," she answered. "Nothing more." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then why were you spending nights with your business associate while planning our wedding?" The room became so quiet that the air conditioning was suddenly louder than the guests. Vanessa's expression hardened. "He's spying on me now," she snapped, pointing toward me. Ethan shook his head. "No, he was protecting me." Those 6 words hit me harder than I expected. Vanessa realized she was losing control, and immediately changed tactics. Tears filled her eyes, almost on command. "Ethan, please. Your father never accepted me. He's manipulated everything because he can't stand the idea of losing you." Ethan quietly opened the evidence binder and handed it back to him before leaving the library. Without raising his voice, he removed the certified marriage certificates, the hotel photographs, and the transcript of the recorded conversation. He placed them one by one on the head table, where both families could see them. "Did he manipulate these 2? He asked. Vanessa stared at the documents but didn't touch them. She knew exactly what they were. "Answer me." She remained silent. Was our marriage part of a plan? Still nothing. Finally, Ethan picked up his phone, pressed play, and Vanessa's own voice echoed through the ballroom. 12 more weeks and everything falls into place. A few guests exchanged confused looks. Then Derek's voice followed. "Ethan still doesn't suspect anything." The recording continued for only another 20 seconds before Ethan stopped it. He didn't need to play the rest. The damage had already been done. Vanessa looked around the room, but there wasn't a single friendly face left. Even her own parents avoided looking at her. She took one desperate step toward Ethan. "I can explain." He slowly removed the wedding band from his finger and placed it on the table beside the evidence binder. "No," he said quietly. "You can explain it to your attorney." He turned toward the guests. "I'm sorry all of you came here to celebrate a marriage that should never have happened." Then he looked back at Vanessa one final time. "This wedding is over." Without another word, he walked across the ballroom and stopped beside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, for the first time in months, my son looked at me the way he used to when he was a little boy, asking for guidance. Behind us, I could hear Vanessa shouting that we had ruined her life. I didn't turn around. People who build their lives on lies almost always say the same thing when the truth finally catches them. 6 months have passed since the day my son's wedding ended before the reception ever truly began. Looking back, I don't remember the decorations, the music, or the expensive dinner that was never finished. I remember the moment Ethan chose the truth over the life he thought he wanted. Vanessa tried to challenge the prenuptial agreement, accused me of invading her privacy, and threatened to sue everyone involved in the investigation. None of it survived the evidence. Every recording had been obtained legally. Every photograph was time-stamped. Every statement from Matthew Collins and Jonathan Hayes matched the documents Brian Pierce had uncovered. Faced with overwhelming proof, Vanessa quietly withdrew her claims before the case ever reached trial. Derek Sullivan disappeared from Colorado only weeks later, and neither of them ever contacted my family again. Ethan moved into a small apartment across town and insisted on paying for everything himself. He returned every credit card I'd ever given him and refused every offer of financial help. "I need to know I can stand on my own," he told me one afternoon. For the first time in months, I believed him. We didn't rebuild our relationship with apologies. We rebuilt it with ordinary moments, Saturday breakfasts, fishing trips, quiet conversations that had nothing to do with lawyers, investigations, or betrayal. Trust didn't return all at once. It returned one honest decision at a time. One evening, Ethan looked at me and asked the question I've been waiting to hear. Dad, why didn't you stop the wedding sooner? I smiled because I'd asked myself that same question 100 times. Because if I tried to stop it with only my opinion, I answered, you would have spent the rest of your life wondering if you had married the right woman and lost her because of me. I paused before continuing. I needed you to see the truth with your own eyes. Only then could the decision truly belong to you. Ethan nodded slowly. You didn't save me from a bad marriage. He looked out across the lake before finishing his thought. You saved me from spending the rest of my life defending the wrong person. Those words meant more to me than any courtroom victory ever could. People often believe the greatest gift a parent can leave a child is money, property, or an inheritance. I disagree. The greatest gift is judgment, the ability to recognize character before charm, truth before promises, and actions before beautiful words. If my story leaves you with anything, let it be this. Never trust someone because they know exactly what you want to hear. Trust the person whose actions remain honest, even when no one is watching. Thank you for spending this time with me. If Walter's story meant something to you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you would have done in Ethan's place. And if you enjoy stories about family, betrayal, redemption, and the quiet strength that changes lives, don't forget to subscribe to When Darkness Awakens. Sometimes the people who love us the most are the ones willing to break our hearts before someone else breaks our lives.